Miral twitched as a rustle of vegetation caught his ear. Alert, he strode to Elfgar, who woke Elfrith, who was dozing by the campfire. All guards were alert since the capture of Ethelfled, over a month ago, and yes, there were feet, not approaching the camp honestly, but sneaking up on them. A Dane, Miral presumed, a stinking spy, who? A crack underfoot, in the opposite direction had the commander turning. Two of them. But it was Aldhelm, who had his sword aloft and who touched Miral on the arm. In the moonlight, he saw the king's right-hand man nod, he had heard the noise too, and presumed the same. Aldhelm twitched his sword in the direction of the noise and strode carefully towards it. Elfgar nodded to Elfrith and then gestured in the direction of the men, Osrith's men, although every day he was assuming her role. A scream rang out and a commotion as Miral turned. Leaving Elfgar to his men, Miral hurried to his lord. Aldhelm was holding his hand. He bit me, the bastard, but he broke off when he saw Miral had put his arm around her shoulders. It's all right, Miral replied, pulling Osrith to him. It's bloody not, the bastard, heathen. I'm sorry, Lord Aldhelm, Osrith interjected. I came, when I could. Osrith. Aldhelm's voice was flat, for she had bitten him very hard. Over a bowl of stew, Osrith told her commanders that Ethelfled was safe, or as sad as she could be under the circumstances. They are treating her with respect, Osrith clarified, through bites of bread. What can be done? In your opinion, Osrith, what can be done? Aldhelm, still touching his hand every so often, made his question plain. But he was looking at a face which was scanning the horizon, and he turned. Miral was, himself, rising to his feet. Osrith had heard the noise, too. Perhaps she had. Perhaps it was her own heart beating. Could you go back? Aldhelm asked, his voice quick and distracted. I could go back, Osrith agreed. I did not leave being pursued, I could go back. She got to her feet. Time to share her plans. I could get close to the lady, I could help her, she nodded. Our army could get close enough, and then you could attack. If the Lady Ethelfled is in no immediate danger, get close to her, Aldhelm commanded. If you can. If the Danes and Norse are in disarray, help her flee. Somehow, get her away from Beamflout. We have the army, plus we have the Wessex army. And, as Osrith was about to leave, she saw what Miral and Aldhelm were beginning to look at. And heard it herself. There was a rumble in the earth, getting louder, until an army rode straight into the Wessex encampment. Two Wessex armies, then, said Miral, and Osrith followed them across to see the Lord Odda dismount and stand before King Alfred. As she looked, Osrith could see chests on a cart, guarded by West Saxons. He had brought the money then, she thought, grimly. The King of Wessex was about to forfeit the kingdom, and surrender every person living in it. The king is here? Osrith asked, as Odda bowed to Alfred. She saw her former lord take in the view of the precious metal. He arrived a week ago, wanted to oversee the proceedings. As Osrith looked, she saw men she knew, Odda's men. He had raised the Devonshire Fid, for what he considered a last stand against the Danes to protect his homeland. Elfgar had explained to her that without the express permission of the king, it was treachery. But Osrith could not blame her former lord. Indeed, she respected his decision. What was Alfred thinking, allowing it to get that far? Allowing men to feel so desperate that they would defy him to save their kingdom? Yet, Ethelfled was his favorite, and he was a father. Even if he had tried to manage the situation, she was different, she was always different. Not even his son, Edward, would have provoked him to be standing within a mile of the fortress that might have held him. Alfred was in it until the end, whatever that end was. Indistinct thoughts were clouding in the back of Osrith's mind as she watched the king welcome his lord. Alfred was clever, Sinard, as Domhnall might say, he used his head. There was intelligent cunning behind the man. Was it really gold and silver displayed so obviously in view to anyone who would care to look, or just boxes that contained nothing more valuable than air? And if it were gold and silver, did he have a backup plan? I will do what I can, Osrith said, vaguely. And then, because if she hadn't asked, she would never have forgiven herself. "Do I get my men back?" Osrith, Aldhelm said, peering down his nose at her, as was his habit to most people, being so tall. "If you could bring the Lady Ethelfled safely back to us, you can have your men back, Heaven. You can have any men you like back. The whole army. Just bring her back." And so Osrith said nothing more, looked nothing further upon the reuniting of the King of Wessex and his dearest lord, who was now his greatest traitor. Instead, she strode towards Beamflout, to liberate the king's daughter. 88,888,888. Osrith heard the noise before she could see the gates of Beamflout. The noise of merriment, raucousness, drunkenness in full swing. The gates were closed, but not guarded, so clearly the brothers had decided to allow their men to relax and celebrate the wealth that was soon to be theirs. The stables had been opened and there were men hanging out of the windows, laughing, vomiting, pissing in corners. They were happy, and were celebrating, and games were being played, one which Osrith remembered from the Thurgilson's Yule celebrations, a tug-of-war. They were this side of drunk, with enough faculties to still be entertained by games. How to blend in, Osrith thought, and took up a tankard from a very soused Dane who was lying in a bundle of horse feed, snoring, and pretended to stagger around, looking pleased and happy. A voice came to her ear and a hand to her elbow, and Osrith jumped, seeing Rorik, a look of concern on his face. He had never seen her before she had arrived at Beamflout disguised, but had accepted Osrith to be Norse or Danish, in a very matter-of-fact way. That he had noticed her absence was both touching, but also concerning. She swung her wooden pot towards him and grinned what she hoped was the grin of the merry. "Osrith, where have you been?" "Looking for the princess," she replied, swinging her tankard towards the place Ethelfled was, or had been the last time she had seen her. But Rorik put his hand to her mouth. "You've been looking for her all that time? Come," he ushered, and led her to the main hall. "The Lord Eric put her aloft, so all can see who is to bring her treasure," Rorik explained, pointing upwards. In a cage level with the gantry used, from what Osrith could see, as an access point to it, sat the daughter of Alfred. She was sitting, knees to her chest and her arms wrapped around her legs and, as Osrith looked, her face was red. It looked as if she had been crying. It was no wonder you could not find her. "Did the food go to waste?" "I took it back to the kitchens," Osrith replied, thinking quickly. And by the look of the amount of maids usually working in the kitchens now keeping the tipsy Northman company, added, "There wasn't anyone about. No one told me." She looked in the direction of the kitchens again. "I wonder, should I go back and give it to her?" But Rorik shook his head. "You are one of Eric's men, are you not?" he asked, and Osrith wondered whether she detected a touch of suspicion in his face. But it passed quickly when he added, "My Lord Heston said we need to be aware, there is trouble." "She cannot starve," Osrith said, hoping the concern was out of the ultimate idea of wealth and glory. "I will get her food, then." She thrust the drinking cup towards him. "Right," said Rorik, brightly, and took it. The kitchens were indeed deserted. Food which was destined for eating lay half prepared on plates. A roast pig on a spit had been only a little stripped of its flesh and bread was on the table along with apples and large flagons of ale were standing, as if waiting to be taken out to a table somewhere. Behind her, stumbled a Northman, who hailed her with a fist before stumbling off with a plate of bread and pork. It was her chance, Osrith thought. Already, it was assumed her job was to give Ethelfled her food, so by climbing up to her to hand it over, Osrith would be in a position to see how she could get her down. So, she started to prepare a bowl of pork and bread, apples and a jug of ale, something which she had brought to Ethelfled daily and would not look amiss. It was when she was turning to go that she found him, her youngest warrior. She had seen Elfkin before at the stables, and now, shrinking behind the thick oak door as she watched the boy come to help himself to the good food before him. Osrith was pleased to see as he fed himself, that Elfkin was not thin and looked well treated. He jumped when Osrith stepped towards him, however, a look of horror on his face. Clearly, Osrith looked like a Dane to him and, as a slave, He should not be eating all that food. Elfkin, she said gently, and watched the boy's expression change. Captain? He asked, tentatively. Osrith nodded. I heard you were captured. I have come to bring you back. You, and the lady, she added, for a closer approximation of the truth. Now, she is up there, the Lady Ethelfled? Elfkin nodded. So we are going to get her out, somehow? I have a plan. And Osrith told him the plan. She told him that he was to pass out as much ale from the pots as possible, spend most of the night doing that, making the men more and more drunk. While you are doing that, I am going to get her down, and we are going to take the horses. They are free, are they not? Unguarded, Elfkin agreed, grinning. And, I have seen you tend them, so I know they are fit to ride out of the fortress, to the camp. Elfkin grinned more, pleased at her praise of him. Do you have your sword? Osrith asked, and at once, his face fell. It was taken from me when the Danes came, he said, sadly. So Osrith felt herself reach to her hip, and she withdrew her own Sikh's, once tagged's. She held it out to him, and Elfkin went to take it, but at the last moment, Osrith drew it away from him. I want it back, when you're done, she added, before taking off its belted scabbard. Elfkin buckled it over his shoulder, so it hung crossways over his body, and thrust the Sikhs inside it. I will make you proud, Captain. Elfkin declared. You'll see. And so Osrith climbed the steps to the gantry that hung by Ethelflaed's cage, watching Elfkin go about the plan. It was working stupendously and, as she watched, the drunken behavior of the Norse and Danes grew steadily more stupid and dangerous. Only Heston, who looked extremely unsettled, pacing around, unable to settle with his ale, was spoiling this unanimous intoxication. And Eirik. For she noticed that whenever Elfkin brought him ale, he took it, and then was pouring a good deal into his brother's pot, or away near the table, feigning merriment as he sat around the table. Not once, Osrith noticed, did Eirik look up to Ethelflaed. Yet, there did not seem to be despair in her face, only tiredness and exhaustion. My thanks, Ethelflaed said to Osrith as she passed the food through to the lady, but she shook her hand when Ethelflaed tried to give her a silver piece. I have silver enough of my own, Osrith rebuked, and some would think I own more, and think me a thief. That was enough to make her heart burst open with revenge joy, to see the look on Ethelflaed's face as she realized who Osrith was. The lady had the grace to look down for a moment, and then reach out to her hand. I followed you, to the Britons that night, Ethelflaed confessed. I heard you telling Edward. And I told Ethelwold. Her cornflower blue eyes still seemed to sparkle in the darkness when she asked, Do you hate me? And Osrith found herself shaking her head. I think you were cruel to your brother, Osrith said, carefully. What she wanted to say she did not. What she wanted to say was she was sorry that Ethelflaed was born a princess not a prince, for that was what she truly wanted to be, and she had taken her envy and resentment out on Edward. You would understand if you had a brother, Ethelflaed whispered. Do you have one? Osrith shook her head. She had two, of course. But with someone like Ethelflaed, even in a moment like this where confidences could be shared, she had learned that, once power had tilted back to her, the lady would have no compunction to not use that information to her advantage, or even to her amusement, as Ethelwold had. Eirik is going to free me, Ethelflaed said, and Osrith knew then what was giving her hope. We are fleeing, to make a new life. Not if I can help it, you're not. Osrith bowed to the lady, silently, and instead went to the business of unloading the food, and taking away an empty platter from a previous meal. Sensing that someone was watching her, Osrith made haste, and withdrew. Ethelflaed flicked a small smile at her, as she turned. And then things began to move fast, as Osrith realized that she had been right, Alfred had indeed not allowed things to be left to chance, and the first inkling she got of this was when she saw, quite clearly, Sihtric Jutansson standing by the door, in a pose that he must have thought was nonchalant, but Osrith noticed was casually alert. A fight was unfolding in the hall, between what looked like one of Heston's men and one of Eirik's, and the men had cleared a space for this to happen. But the scrap had ended prematurely when a call of fire rang out, and Osrith could see flames licking the night sky, consuming, she gathered, from its direction, the whole of the northern rampart and the stables. Horses were galloping, terrified, all through the courtyard, as men too blotted to see and catch them, were upended and fell in the mud and the chaos. Below her, as Osrith scrambled down, she saw that her job has been thieved. Clapper, one of Utad's men, was attempting to hammer open the chain that fixed the rope to a pulley that was holding Ethelflaed's cage, and it was then she knew that it was her brother who had been Alfred's plan, and always had been, no matter what Eric had told her. Later, Osrith would consider how proper her brother really was. Despite his lifestyle, Utad wanted the prestige and order which came with Saxon hierarchy, and would chide and bully those who didn't follow his rules, and here he was ensuring the line of Alfred in the kingdom of Wessex was not consumed by the Danes and Norse, no matter how kin he felt he was to them. So, all Osrith needed to do was to allow Utad to succeed. Osrith ducked as a war axe narrowly missed her head for, incredibly, the two men who had been fighting over the woman were still fighting, despite the fact that the fortress was steadily, determinedly, being eaten up by the fire. As Ethelflaed was lowered, Osrith hurried to the cage, picking up a dagger in the process from one very inebriated Dane and handing it to her through the bars. "Do not forget to fight as I showed you," she hissed to Ethelflaed, before she was pulled out by Utad. Osrith saw the look pass between the lady and her brother, before, unbelievably, he pushed Ethelflaed in the direction of her lover. "Go. Now." She heard him shout, above the noise of the chaos, and Osrith felt her heart lose its heat. Had she misread the situation? He was letting Ethelflaed and Eric flee. Scrambling over the bodies of prone Danes and Norse. Those standing did not look very closely as looked like them, and was trying to douse the flames which had now taken hold of the hall. She crossed the straw-strewn hall and was in arm's reach of her brother when Sihtric landed a blow which would have struck between Osrith's shoulder blades. In time, she ducked under his arm and aimed a foot at his stomach, which was enough to make him misstep. Behind Sihtric, Finan caught her, holding her body as he drew Soul Stealer high. Giving tagged Seeks to Elfkin had been a big mistake. Osrith could not get Buey out quickly enough. Just as she expected a blade to the gut, she felt Finan stop, and let her go from his grasp. She followed his gaze. And saw. And heard. Heard words which, in her imperfect Norse sounded like traitor and brother. Siegfried had run Eric through. No. Osrith screamed, pushing Finan out of the way. She saw the tail end of Ethelflaed, her dress streaming out of the hall's door as she was dragged along by Utad. Finan, of course, was soon in his wake, Siegfried Thorgilson on their tail, but not for long, for the fortress burned too fiercely. If they were going to recapture Ethelflaed, they would need to abandon Beamflout Fortress and clear as many men who were fit to go from it immediately. Osrith breathed deeply, as the adrenaline made her heart beat faster, and she slipped to her knees beside her dying friend as fire crackled around them. Siegfried had, at least, ensured Eric's hand was wrapped around his sword, so he would be guaranteed Valhalla. Tears sprang to her eyes, ones born of her bond with him, of kinship in arms, and she put a hand to his cheek. Osrith ... Krigikvind, he managed, blood choking in his throat. And then he was gone. Gone to Valhalla, she supposed. The fire was getting more intense as Osrith's hand dropped to his, which held his sword. What would he have done? Win and lose, and feel the same about both, because both are deceivers. There would be no benefit to dying in the fire herself. Eric Thorgilson, a man she respected, had been killed by his brother for trying to cheat him, having fallen in love with Ethelflaed, and made plans to abduct her, for sliver of a chance of a life together. Elfkin, Osrith's thoughts shouted, and she looked desperately around at the slim hope of finding him amongst the blazing wood. She needed to leave the fortress, but Osrith knew that she could not do until she had done what she could to find him. Heading towards the stables, Osrith held up an arm to shelf her face from the flames. He had tagged Seeks, Osrith thought. If Elfkin was there, the weapon would be perishing with him. In her heart, she still clung to hope. He was a plucky, intelligent young boy who had sense. But she would not be leaving without him. Osrith turned and looked back to the hall. Eric had his funeral pyre well enough, and she scanned the ramparts for any that may be intact, any that may hold her young soldier. A flicker of movement towards the south gate, and Osrith ran to it, leaping more drunken Danes and Norse, whose indulgence in strong ale would, perhaps, anesthetize the pain of burning to death. She looked up, but it could see no one. The movement might well have come from the brothers' battle standard which fluttered, ragged, on a pole, most of it flame food. Damn it. Where was he? Last time she had seen Elfkin, he had been heading back to the kitchens, and so Osrith's feet took her around the southeastern edge of the palisade wall towards the eastern entrance of the kitchen. Perhaps he was inside. This was stone-floored and two walls were made of reclaimed rocks. If he had the sense Osrith thought he had, Elfkin might well be in there. She charged inside, looking around. Beyond, the courtyard flames were beginning to climb higher and Danes and Norse were pulling one another, frantically trying to make their egress from the fortress. No Elfkin. He was not in the scullery or the food store, neither was he near the culvert, where the bourne which flowed, eventually, towards the sea was used to wash the excess of blood from animal carcasses. Think. Think. Osrith banged her head with her hand, as the growing realization that she might have to abandon Beamflout without him began to invade her mind. Perhaps he had got out then, a conciliatory voice in her head told her. Elfkin was as clever as she thought he was, and if he could, he would have fled, and tried to get back to his older brother. So she turned to hurry from the kitchens, to take one last look around, and stepped towards the door. I know you. A voice behind her stopped Osrith in her tracks, and she looked over her shoulder. Yes, Heston the Dane continued, I know you. Osrith ran, and began to tear off across the ground between the kitchen door and the east wall. Oh no you don't. His bulk at odds with his speed, Heston followed and caught up with Osrith, holding her in a bear hug. Now, don't struggle, Wakilt, he scolded, as Osrith tried to shake her body loose, and he felt about her chest for her breasts. Pity, he added. But I have you now, and I will. But, whatever Heston was about to say was replaced by a howl of pain, and he let go of her, turning round and lashing out. But Elfkin struck his foot again with tagged seeks, as the Dane roared again. Come on, urged Osrith, as Elfkin stood still, watching Heston dance a dance of pain from his skewered feet. Her heart was beginning to beat faster as the uplifting feeling of finding him began to sink in. Are there any horses? Some, Elfkin said, and they both got out of the eastern gate. Around them, Northmen were staggering, trying to get out of the way of the inflamed building, while some were trying to drag others. Many horses were free, and were fleeing the burning, but a couple were staggering around too, as if skittish, but waiting for their masters. One close by seemed to be quite placid, a white mare which at once Elfkin hurried to, the horse's demeanor softening as he placed his hand to her mouth. Clearly, the animal knew Elfkin, who was allowing her to sniff his hand as he petted her. Slipner. That was what Eric had named the horse on which they had escaped Caeligwalid. Oh, how was it he was dead? And, for the first time, as she helped Elfkin up in front of her, Osrith knew that however bad she had felt, it would be nothing to how Ethelfled would be feeling. It felt much longer than it really had been until Osrith rode back into the mercenaries' camp. Two guards challenged Osrith, who rode straight past their spear points. They chased her on foot, although Osrith did not notice immediately take them in, such was her desperation to get back to Aldhelm. The two guards who, in the moonlight, Osrith did not know, were now running to Miral's and Alfga's tents, the latter appearing in his shirt, looking as if he did not expect to be disturbed. Osrith, he declared, as Elfkin slipped from the saddle and, looking around as more men came to surround Slipner, helped her down too. You look awful. Your men. Osrith declared, as Aldhelm paced next to her, listening. Move them, they should stand with the Wessex army. There will be a shield wall when the Danes come. Her words were ragged as she spoke to the mercenary general, and he paused, making sure she had a chance to say everything she wanted to him. We saw there was a fire, Aldhelm declared, after listening to the rest of her story. But, when she came to Ethelfled, Aldhelm shook his head. No, no, he disclaimed. Neither the lady, nor the Lord Utad have been here. He looked around his commanders, who had joined the shouting that a raider was attacking. Each declared that they had not seen the lady, not the Lord Untad return to them. Osrith's heart, which, until now, was buoyant with optimism, started to chill. He had not brought Ethelfled back? Or, he could be, now, allowing her to flee East Anglia, Britain, in any case. Assemble, Aldhelm ordered, when no other information was provided. He turned his head to the men, and looked for their captains. Commanders, get your men. We assemble. But then he broke away. To the left of Ethelred, for whom Aldhelm spoke, stood the King of Wessex. Osrith looked at his face, poker straight, emotionless. Had he heard her say about Ethelfled? If she had gone with Utad, did he wonder where she was? Or was Alfred the great king Osrith suspected, and knew where his bonded man was? And behind them, as a rhythmic thump of enemy boots could be heard, horses, and they all turned to see, sitting before Utad Daneslayer, the daughter of the king. Place a guard around my daughter, ordered Alfred, when she had slipped from the saddle. Father, I can fight, she declared, but Alfred merely gave her a look, and said nothing to her, but urged the guards on, of which one was Alfrith. Osrith felt dampness on her face and realized it had begun to rain, and she, still clad as a Dane, moved to position in the shield wall that was assembling, kneeling in the second row at the most dangerous spot, the center of the line. At last, Osrith would be in battle, and would have no chance to turn when men either side of her lost control of their bladders and their bowels, slipping on guts freed from stomachs by the Norsemen and Danes, in the honorable tradition of respect, from Eric Thurgilson. Chancing a glance behind her, Osrith saw that Ethelfled, still surrounded by men, had something clutched in her hand. Was it the dagger Osrith had given her? She really hoped so. Guards were as vulnerable as any other soldier when a battle began, more so if the guards were taken out. Could she have the presence of mind to use the weapon? Could she take a Sikh's sword and save her own life? And it began. Osrith crouched behind West Saxons who were inhabiting the front line, and she thought she recognized Odda's men, although the rain was getting more intense and was dripping into her eyes. As well as blood, mud would cause the lines to slip, and Osrith ground her boots as far down into the ground as she could, to give herself as much grip as she could when the line was leaned on. It didn't take long, and although they were fewer in number, and mostly inebriated, the Norse, led by Siegfried, and the Danes captained by Heston, had broken down parts of the shield wall, trying to break the armies into discrete groups that would be easier to fight. They were far more ferocious, fighting for their lost honor promised by the Thurgilsons, of wealth and land, the gaining of which was now much further away from their grasp. Osrith's section had been driven back, and were fighting against a dozen men, Rorik one of them, she noticed, and realized that a lot of the men were youngsters, having used their agility and youthful energy to push them away. But they were unwise in tactics, so Osrith called to the West Saxons and Mersins, who were holding their own, that they should form a narrow shape, a swineshed, with which to break them apart. She placed herself next to Elfgar, who clapped her on the shoulder and relayed this to the 3 men of her division who were with them and West Saxons she did not know. Falkberg instantly clicked into position near the front, undercutting the first 2 youngsters as Oshir took on 2 more with Egelulf. Elfkin, she could not see, neither Leofstan. Osrith could see that Miral was fighting furiously on his own against 2 of Heston's men, and she inched herself back towards Ethelfled, who was holding the dagger in both hands, clutched to her chest. But it looked to Osrith that she was unafraid of the battle, and was, instead, reading the land, reading the men, their positions, their actions. Behind her, 3 more West Saxons slipped into the swineshed position, and the whole little company were doing their utmost to hammer the Danes and Norse away, those youths, though energetic, meeting their demise through strategy and tactics of the Saxons' positions. And then she saw Miral stumble. 2 Danes were upon him as he slipped in the mud, but Osrith had seen and had come in next to them, hammering one in the neck with her Sikhs, before turning on the other. It was Heston. He paused in his fighting, however, to turn to Miral, who was now, back in the mud, struggling backwards, to try to get an advantage. Why wasn't he attacking her? Osrith thought, as Heston raised his axe to Miral. Then, the moonlight glinted off her Thor's hammer. He hadn't recognized her. This was an advantage, and it sunk into her mind as she threw herself at Heston, just as the blow was about to land on her commander, knocking the Dane into the mud. Around them, other Danes assumed Osrith was on her side. One even helped her up, as she thrust down tagged Sikhs into his calf. He screamed, and rolled in the mud, but the Dane who had helped her up was now sword to sword with a pair of West Saxons. Miral had his feet now, and had now engaged with 2 Norse. Osrith looked to the swine shed. It was holding against more Danes. She made to go to join them, to fill in a gap on the left flank. Behind Miral, Ethelfled had found herself a sword, and was fighting alongside Uthed, who was parrying Dane and Norse with Ethelfled by his side. And then she struck Siegfried, who was coming towards them. His daggered hand towards Ethelfled suddenly stopped. The Lady of the Mercens had driven Uthed's sword through his chest. Osrith turned. And it was tagged, running towards the Norse, holding his sword aloft. He would need his Sikhs, Osrith thought, wondering vaguely where Elfkin was, that she could get it back for him as she became there, by his side, as one of Siegfried's men was about to deliver a fatal strike. He staggered backwards, but not from injury. Instead, Finan, not tagged, circled his sword round in a wide arc and pushed the metal blade through the back of another Norse warrior who was coming into his left, before turning to Osrith. Or, where Osrith had been. She was now at the back of the disintegrated shield wall, hold together a thin like with Elfrith and 2 other warriors. Aldhelm was at his side as the Wessexman that Oda had raised, from his lands in Devonshire, fought with more ferocity and skill than ever could be attributed to Shawls, men who she had passed, no doubt, all of those months ago, when she had rode with Oda's guard through the very west of West Saxon territory. A terrible roar of men meeting men arose to their left, but Osrith was unperturbed, and continued to meet Siegfried's men, shouting at them in Norse that their gods were a fallacy and that Odin had damned them. And some time later a shout went up, which was someone for the West Saxons calling a retreat. Another called the Mercens. Osrith turned to go. And then turned to meet a blade. It was Finan. He saw her Thor's hammer, and what had saved her when she had gone to help Miral was now her disadvantage. She swung, trying to dislodge Soul Stealer from its position, but Finan bore down on her, grinning madly. She was a Dane to him, Osrith knew, and she held on to Bué with all her might, pushing him back with her left hand against his shoulder, the wailing, keening yell curdling in her throat. Then drew Bué away. Finan stumbled forward, keeping his feet, and Osrith swung in a different direction. For he had not seen Heston the Dane, who had managed to stagger upright, thrust towards Finan, and she twisted, unbalancing him, and stepped over the man, running towards the Mercens. It took some time for the battle sounds to ebb away, for the Northmen to be called away by Heston, who had now inherited a good deal of wealth from the dead Thurgilson brothers. Wessex and Mercen men began to gather the dead, gather weapons and anything salvageable, which would please both Stipu and Miral, who would reuse, and get reforged, anything they could. Osrith made her way, injured, but alive, in the direction of the majority of the Mercens, vowing to help when she had gathered her breath. She surveyed the battlefield. Morning was on its way, and with it, the springtime sun would sneakily expose the killing of the night, like a child telling tales to a parent. In the end, there had not been enough Danes to match the Mercens and West Saxons, and the victory was settled. When Osrith found her men, she was deeply happy to account for all 5 of them, but Elfga's stand-in as he replaced Osrith, who had a slice from a sharp sword down his body. Leofstan had lost a lot of blood, but was still able to limp off the field with her division. Elfga was dead. She found Elfrith pulling his friend's cloak around his shoulders, and Osrith got to her feet and stepped towards her comrade to help him. A man blocked the sunlight, casting a shadow over her. "Untain Anagam," Finan said to her, his face covered in blood. His eyes were earnestly searching her own face, and Osrith put her hand to her cheek. "Don't tell me, I got a bit of blood on me." Nothing that the Thames over there won't get off, he replied. She made to step past him, but Finan stood in her way. Osrith met the Irishman's eyes made to turn, but she found a hand closed around her left wrist. You turned from me, in the hall, she accused, trying to get free. But Finan had her fast. Out of the corner of her eye she saw Elfrith stiffen as he watched them. I heard you shout Taine, and I saw your palm. As a dying Dane let out a death groan, Osrith unfolded her left hand and looked at it. The scar? Is that what he meant? She had never exchanged more than a score of words with the man, not been in his company more than half a dozen times, yet he had noticed her hand? What else had he noticed? Breathing deeply, she shook her hand from him again, and he'll go. Osrith loosed Bue's hilt and looked up to him. You saved my life in the river, Finan Nanalaid. Morantain. Morantain, Osrith nan Mercia, Finan replied, nodding towards Heston, who was stumbling towards fleeing Northmen. It was good to see his astonishment when she replied, Ze Urbitha. My thanks, he repeated, in English. Then, turning a little, his eye searching for Utad, added, Toilek dollars a cherort. And you, Finan Moore, she replied, then, turned herself and strode over to where Elfrith was beginning to bind the wrapped body of Elfgar. Finan Moore. Finan the mighty. Mighty in strength, mighty-hearted, like all the Irishmen she had known. Yet, with a cleft of sadness running through him which only service to her brother would mend, it would seem. She helped Elfrith lift Elfgar onto one of the wooden carts painted in green and gold, the colours of Mercia, where it would make its way back to Aylesbury for burial. He had done his duty, Osrith had done hers, as had Elfrith and Miral and Ethliad, who was still staring at the blood-soaked figure of his wife, whose head was now being shrouded with a blanket and escorted from the field. Ethliad knew the measure of her now, she was Alfred's daughter and, if he had ever thought that the equilibrium of power between Wessex and Mercia was shifting in Mercia's favour after his wedding, it was boldly clear that it was not. He would have to carry out expansionism of his own, to at least show Alfred he had not capitulated. For, capitulation would show some in Mercia he was not fit to rule the kingdom, and the result would be weakness, as a civil war ensued. Far better to unite Mercia in something which went to the heart of all Mercians, and excluded the West Saxons. Osrith suspected she knew exactly what he could do, and to whose mind she could plant the suggestion. As the Mercian army crossed the Thames into East Anglia, and the Fleet River, into their own kingdom, Osrith watched, sadly, as the army of Wessex trailed southwest. Odda, her former lord, was with them. She knew that he would be tried for treason, even if his foresight and action had saved the kingdom. Alfred could not overlook it. It would surely pain him to execute his friend. A weight, like a cold block of ice, formed in her stomach, and Osrith blinked her eyes to arrest the tears. Miral says Aldhelm wishes to speak to you. Good, thought Osrith. She wished to speak to him, too. But it was Ethliad who had summoned her and, at their camp that night, she stood before the Lord of Mercia. But it was the Lady of the Mercians who called Osrith to them. Battle-injured, Osrith noiced Ethelfled had a look about her, as if an internal calm had steadied her. Build on the rock, St. Peter had said, a firm foundation. And by the look of Ethelfled, her bedrock was granite. I will be returning to Aylesbury, my wife, Ethliad continued, casting a strange look to Ethelfled, one of concern, no, one of uncertainty. I have granted her, for her bravery, further estates to add to those gifted when we were married. So, in Saltwick, she will need no more guard. There was a pause. She was surely not going to be dismissed, having fought so well? Osrith felt the weight of eyes upon her, her own men. Miral, who was supporting himself with a stick. Aldhelm was beside Ethliad, and was giving Osrith his usual peering frown. You went, of your own accord to the aid of my wife, Ethliad said. You have fought, spilled blood, put yourself in danger for her, for us. Ethliad rose to his feet. Osrith Lackland, you have honored the kingdom of Mercia. And so, in recognition for your bravery and courage, I would have you and your men transferred to Wessex. No. Not there, Osrith thought, desperately. if I fought so well for you, can I not return to Aylesbury? I am keeping guard for my own protection, at Winchester, and I want the best. Your men, Lord Elfgar's men. Osrith smiled. Her friend had got back his title and presumably his lands, if posthumously, to remain in King Alfred's realm to protect my interests. I am sending you Aldhelm, he added, gesturing to his counselor, who is most in debt to you, for you saved his life. A cheer arose, as Osrith's mind turned to Aldhelm. She did not remember saving his life. But, now, Wessex? Again? I will murder Ethelwold for you, Aelfrith hissed, as Aethliad dismissed her, and waved forward Miral. But keep your temper, for heaven's sake. Osrith smiled at him, as she thought of Elfgar. His death left a big hole in her army. Osrith had come to rely on his advice and they worked well to execute strategy with the men. So, Wessex it was going to be. Osrith had not been able to retrieve her silver in the stables, and she wondered if it was still there. Is there a restriction on where I stay? Osrith asked Aldhelm, later, as he briefed her on her duties. Your men must stay at the palace. If you feel it more suitable for you yourself to live outside the palace, and you relinquish your duties suitably, then this will be acceptable. Aldhelm put a hand on her back. Look, it won't be half so dangerous as on a battlefield. The Lord Aethliad is paying you a great honor. But Osrith's sillies was not to do with herself, or rather, not altogether. At least she didn't have to live at the palace. Instead, it was for Aethliad. He looked pale, distracted, a lord, king in a but name, haunted by the very offensive he wished to pull off himself that was being pulled off by the shrewd, cunning, intelligent king of Wessex. But there would be advantages. She would be able to see if her brother had more silver for her to steal, for one, and she now had captaincy, and battle experience. Aethliad was in her debt for saving the honor of Mercia, or at least contributing to it. Best of all, King Alfred could not remove her from her position, for she was there under Aethliad's direction. Are you pleased to be going south? Aelfrith asked, as the men prepared to leave. They were pleased to be honored by Lord Aethliad, too, and knew Winchester to be a rich, easy land. It was saved, Osrith thought. I'm pleased. I am a captain and command men. I am representing the Lord of Mercia. And, I have unfinished business, she added, silently. Aelfrith left soon after. He would be joining them when he had collected his wife from Aylesbury, and was marching with the mercenaries back there for this task. Ethel was going to be pleased, he told Osrith, for she had left behind many friends there. But, she was surprised when, as her men were about to leave to catch up with the West Saxon army, when she was approached by a priest. Biccar had touched her arm and surprised her, but she had smiled when she saw him, and Thyra, who spoke to her. You are to be in Wessex again, said the Danish woman. Visitors, please Edra. And Osrith found herself nodding, as she extracted a Sikh steer to her from the hands of her youngest soldier. Elfkin relinquished it without question, for Osrith had already rewarded him one better than he had before. I agree, Osrith nodded, answering in Danish, and she saw Biccar look over to his wife for confirmation, a slight look of surprise in his eye as they left. Be surprised, Osrith thought, as he helped his wife onto his sable horse, heading towards the river. And, as they began to march themselves, Osrith thought that she knew the best thing about not being in Mercia, she would not have to see the Lady Ethelflaed ever again.